All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel, What Movement Politics Looks Like After Election Day. My name is Brandy Brooks. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the co-director of the Political Healers Project, and it is my great pleasure to be your moderator for this morning's session. When I was thinking about what it is about this session that really excites me, um, it came down to just basically that I need a different kind of politics to actually address the things that I and my family and the people I love really need and want in our lives. Especially as we are in this moment when we are dealing with the ongoing pandemic of COVID-19, when we are watching our country deeply wrestle with its legacy of racial inequity and racial violence, and when so many other ongoing crises that have been hitting our communities are, are persisting, we're seeing time and time again how the way that we currently do politics, the way that we currently make decisions about how we live together is utterly failing our communities. And so when I think about the kind of politics that I need, it has to be a politics that's rooted in us showing up as our authentic selves, with our stories, with our histories, both of trauma, but also of resilience and the ways that we have survived and the things that we have been able to build. It has to be a politics that is deeply rooted in accountability and in the understanding that we have a right to determine how we live together and to be part of that process in deep and meaningful ways that honor our knowledge and our expertise. And that's why I ran for office in 2018 for Montgomery County Council at large, because I wanted to bring that kind of politics to my local county government. And it's why I am just thrilled to have this amazing group of panelists, elected officials, and movement leaders who are making that kind of politics happen day in and day out at the local and state level. I want to thank the Political Healers Project, People's Action, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center for bringing together this group of folks. And I want to introduce you to our terrific panelists. I'll start. Ruth Buffalo is the representative of the 27th District in the North Dakota House of Representatives, and she is the first Native American Democratic woman to serve in the North Dakota legislature. Mitra Jalali is the Ward 4 council member for the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. Juan Marcano is the Ward 4 council member for the city of Aurora, Colorado. And Elian Farhat is the executive director of Take Action Minnesota. Thank you all so much for being here. It's really, really great to have you. And I want to kick us off by asking you all to, again, share your name and your pronouns, and also to let us know what movement politics means to you. And I'm going to start by kicking it over to Ruth.
Madzigidads, thank you for the wonderful introductions, and it's such an honor to be here in this space with all of you. Niroshadzi nakbaga o madashi mia adeshheads, mabe sigids madzigidads nakbaga o. My name is Ruth Buffalo. I carry my late grandmother Ruth's Hiradza name and her English name. I'm a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, and I'm originally from Mandaree, which is located on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and what movement politics means to me is basically carrying on the work of my ancestors and really working to find healing in spaces that we weren't meant to be in. So, madzigidads, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Juan, how about you? What does movement politics mean to you?
Sure. Thank you, Brandy. Yeah, my name is Juan Marcano. I have the privilege of representing Ward 4 on the Aurora City Council. I use he, his pronouns. And I'm honored to be among such esteemed colleagues here on this panel. And movement politics, to me, is another name for dual power, which is the theory of change that I subscribe to. And that is an inside-outside strategy where grassroots movements really build power outside of the political system by building alternatives to the existing power structure. So that looks like mutual aid networks, popular assemblies, tenants unions, et cetera. also while running folks to get into the existing system. And then once we're there, our job is to amplify the power of these organizations and alternative structures and seek to, basically replace our existing unjust institutions with community-grown solutions. And I believe that it's a long-term strategy that will lead to a better society and more just and equitable society for all of us.
Great, thank you, Juan. Mitra, how about you? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I'm Mitra Jalali. I go by she, hers, and I'm calling from St. Paul, where I represent one of 7 wards on the St. Paul City Council. I'm also a former classroom teacher and organizer. I've worked in policy as a policy aide, and I'm now serving on the council. So I think about this question a lot because I think movement politics, to me, is what happens when the movement, activists, organizers, or just people that are grounded in the issues we're experiencing get elected and they work inside systems with and alongside the movement to shift power and change outcomes for our communities. And it's very hard and messy. It doesn't always feel like a collaboration, but it's also a very real and expected process. And it also just hardly has any rule book or manual. And I think we need to develop practices and mindsets to practice movement politics well and to center healing within that. I think that's really important and kind of the ambitious idea I've been thinking about. And I got the chance to spend a weekend with People's Action movement activists and electeds earlier this year in Chicago at the very beginning of the year to unpack what this means and how we could get unstuck and begin to move more powerfully together. And I've just been very challenged by that space in a great way where I was able to heal a little and also learn some more. So I'm hoping to bring that and more today and to learn from my fellow panelists and from all of you. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Mitra. And Eliane?
Good morning, everyone. Awesome to be on this panel of incredible leaders. My name is Eliane Farhat. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of Take Action Minnesota. I've been organizing for 15 years and I've sort of jumped all over the movement, from electoral organizing to labor organizing, community organizing. And so come to this question really thinking about what are all the different tools and mechanisms we have to build power for people in our country. And for me, I think that's what movement politics really is about. It's about, I've been thinking a lot about I was taught to focus on winning campaigns. And actually we're, as a movement, we're really good at winning campaigns. I mean, we lose, of course, but we can win campaigns. And I've really been thinking about, well, how is that actually distracting us from really realizing the power of our people and really living into a sort of movement politics idea? And so I've started to think about, we shouldn't focus so much on winning everything. We actually need to start focusing on running everything. And when we run everything, that's actually when we'll begin to realize the change and the justice our communities need. And I think so much to what Ruth was saying, we also, when we run things, we can run them in new ways and also in old ways that we know from our ancestors and our people, and we can create new ways together. And so that's very much what I think about when I think about movement politics. It's about this focus on running everything. And then I think for people's organizations like Take Action Minnesota, we're a statewide, multiracial, multi-generational, gender diverse organization that seeks to be a political home for values-aligned Minnesotans. And so for us, movement politics is part of a broader component of what does it actually look like to advance people-centered governance. And that means within our own organization, building a democratic people's organization where we actually practice the process of democracy and people-centered decision-making and figure out, actually we're a testing ground as an organization for how we want our government to operate. It means building people-centered governance in our communities via cooperatives and housing cooperatives, and sort of figure out new ways that we can actually govern ourselves. I think Juan mentioned a little bit about that around mutual aid and other infrastructure. Looks like democracy in our workplaces and organizing our workplaces and partnering with labor. And then sort of what this panel is focusing on is governance, our government centering people and centering us in the decision making. And so so then the last thing I sort of say is sort of like what we're focusing on in this conversation is, like, what does movement politics look like in our government? And it looks like getting folks like Mitra and Ruth and Juan elected for sure. It's like super important. And we need to invest in that type of infrastructure that recruits folks, trains folks, support folks, gets does our part to get them elected. And it looks like supporting them once they're elected. Like the work, like election day is just the beginning, right? And so then also as movement organizations and as organizations that are deeply committed and connected to people who are running for office, our organization is in relationship with Mitra and Ruth now and before they ran for office. And so what is it? Our job is also to then support them once they're elected. And we have a lot of work to do on that front and a lot of growth to do on it, but really supporting what does the organizing look like on the inside and the outside, and then bringing the inside and the outside together to move a powerful sort of people-centered project forward.
Awesome. Thank you all for setting that stage for this conversation. And I want to leap off of something, Mitra, that you said about there not being a rule book for this, because in so many ways we're working to do something that we haven't experienced, we haven't really seen. Sometimes, if we're fortunate, we do have connections to ancestral traditions that help us. But in terms of building this out and within the structures that we live in, we are a little bit, like we are definitely building the plane as we are flying it. So I want to ask, what has been the most challenging part of trying to bring this movement politics into the governing arena? Anyone want to take that on to start?
This is Ruth. I can share a little bit of my experience so far in the state legislature. Something important to note too is that I ran in 2016 in a statewide race for insurance commissioner. I'm a public health professional, and so much work needs to be done here in North Dakota, so there's lots of opportunity for growth and improvement. But one of the most challenging things I think I've seen so far, witnessed, is just people don't really know where to put you. Indigenous women really don't fit in any of the boxes that are listed. For myself, I can't speak for everybody, but that's my experience. As a Hidatsa woman, we are matriarchal and matrilineal, and some of our traditions I took with me into the Capitol. So for example, every House floor session starts with a prayer, and they jump right into the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, I chose to sit during the prayer because that's our traditions and our customs, that women sit and the men stand. And it's not to say that we're weak or anything along those lines. It's completely the opposite, in that men have such great respect for our women, and that has been something in existence since time immemorial within our Hidatsa culture. And so that was something interesting to do and to practice, because even within my caucus, 2 weeks in, you could sense the nervousness, until finally somebody had the courage to ask me, why are you doing that? Are you protesting? And like, no, it's completely the opposite. And so just being in spaces that we haven't traditionally, historically been in, simply by existing and showing up in those spaces, I think is needed. And we had a record number of people visit the state capitol in the last legislative session. We're one of 5 states where we meet every other year. So we're in our off year right now. And so that's just something that comes to mind. And I don't want to take up too much airtime. I know we have limited time to speak, but the other challenge is the support that Elian kind of referred to. And I'm so thankful for Take Action Minnesota. A colleague and I had went to St. Paul for a 1-day summit for women of color leaders, and I was so impressed by the young women who put this event together. And that's when I was introduced to the idea of political healers, and that was so amazing to see young women of color, Indigenous, taking the lead and really centering people, but also the importance of healing and supporting one another. And so I have carried that that support system with me, but it's so important that after people do get elected, that we support them as well. It is uncharted territory. There have been times, you know, when I have been attacked by right-wing media, and I've reached out to my caucus, and I've been told, like, well, we're learning along with you, you know? So it's kind of like, okay, this is great, you know, I'll take the hits, but definitely hoping to provide more support for people who are running for office, and making sure that they get the support that they need to continue to be successful and bring more people with them in these spaces. Madzigads, thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I can chime in here. For me personally, and also just in our local politics here in Aurora, the transition is, you know, kind of a really awkward state because you get a lot of advice from the institution that you are moving into that you need to kind of keep people at arm's length while there is no, you know, I guess institutional knowledge as a movement, since so many of us, you know, come from activism or, you know, we're energized just in the last few years, and we don't have a great deal of, let's say, institutional knowledge about how, you know, different bodies function. It's very easy to be scared and to be separated away. And we saw that happen to some extent after the 2017 elections. And, you know, coming into this in 2019, you know, me and some of my colleagues who, you know, just got elected, we had a slightly better understanding. So I think that having, you know, documenting all of this and sharing being very vulnerable with, you know, our grassroots community, and kind of just explaining how this whole process works is really critical to ensure that we have success going forward. Because a lot of the times the, you know, established folks, especially, you know, our political opposition, who most of the time are, you know, entrenched already in these spaces, are not going to help you and tell you how to, you know, show you how to navigate it. So you have to learn all of this for yourself. And it's our job as, you know, elected leaders in this movement to take that and share it and build a pipeline and train people for what to expect, and to help educate our grassroots organizations for how to advocate, who to advocate to, and, you know, how to best channel their energy to be as effective as possible. And we also need to remember that support doesn't always look like a big group hug for us, because we are regular people, and our community is going to hold us accountable. So we need to not be fragile, we need to be willing to roll with the punches, and we need to expect not just support, but critical support, which means you're gonna, you know, people are gonna tell you how you can do better, or that you let them down in this aspect, but know that they're coming from a good place, that they're on your side, and that they're just helping you do better. Because the work that we're able to do in this space impacts all of us. And I completely, you know, empathize with folks who expect us to do more and who are hard on us. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot, and just very moved by you, Ruth, holding the space where you were in your story really impacted me. So thank you for sharing that. And to kind of combine some of the thoughts that are coming up across what both Juan and Ruth were saying, I mean, one thing I think about a lot is building on that, like, I don't think we like reset expectations for each other after winning elections and before going into governing. And so the like trajectory of get someone elected, and then it's like they go and we kind of get to the next election cycle. But like, we've done that a few cycles here, at least in the Twin Cities. We do have an ecosystem of movement electeds, like folks that literally Take Action Minnesota and organizations like it have trained, supported, gotten elected. And how does that impact the way we do our work? And we've gone from like one Lone Ranger to maybe like 3 to 6, like, and so, but at the same time, like, if a small group of people suddenly can use their platform to just shift the way an entire institution feels and sounds and looks, like a small group of people can raise a whole lot of hell. And so it's not insignificant. And So I think about that, like, is there like a way to build in a place where after you've won your election, but like before you are sworn in and are going into this work, like, how is there a conversation with the movement that got you there to be able to talk through, like, how are we going to hold disagreements where there's something that's scary and hard? How are we going to like show up in those conversations to each other? I think that because so many of us experience the concept of accountability as a scary thing, or like have had toxic or like incomplete accountability practiced on us, it like breaks up our ability to see and value accountability as like a very healthy and beautiful thing, that can bring us closer instead of bringing us further apart. And most of the time, I think I just see like movement breakdowns that rip people apart, and those relationships just like they crash and burn. People walk away from each other, and we don't learn anything, and we're not like holding relationships through that. And so like those habits like hop along for the ride when you go into like movement governing. And how are we figuring out how to leverage the existing relationships we have, but then like really creating a system, or not, system is like such a technical word, but like habits, right? Like habits to practice, like what's movement hygiene? Like that's something that I'm trying to think about for myself. And not just like calling each other in a crisis, but just proactively like normalizing having fun with each other and like joy, and having a movement community of care and joy, so that it's not just like, okay, we're having 100 meetings about the next policy campaign now. But we have to have those too. I mean, that's why you're there, right? To do the work. So I'm not saying replace it with that, but I think that like some humanity is lost for everyone, like when we all go through this. And I just have been thinking a lot about how to fix that. That's something I'm thinking about a lot.
Yeah, I love all this. I feel like it's really powerful. I feel like the thing that I would also add to this is that as organizers and sort of like the outside game, we're actually trained to understand elected officials as immediate like targets and opposition. So we're trained to organize in a way that is oppositional to elected officials. And that works when they're actually in opposition to you. However, it really fails when they're not. So you're actually running a strategy that is just like constantly not just only missing the mark, but actually doing harm to a lot of the work we collectively did to get folks like the people on this panel elected. And so it actually is a two-way street. And it really is around realizing we are actually in a different terrain. And so it doesn't do any good to treat the people who we work hard in partnership to get elected, or to get appointed, or even to get into being staff in offices. I think we can't ignore the power of staff in our governing infrastructure. Like the bureaucracy is designed to work in a way to uphold white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism. It's not, and so like one lone ranger elected official, even a crew of elected officials cannot reform or even transform the institution alone. It actually requires a movement that is deeply aligned, deeply connected, and moving a coordinated inside-outside game. And I think the other thing I would add that's like really important, I think we miss a lot in the movement, is that the outside game needs to be as invested in a strong inside game as we are in a strong outside game. And so what that looks like is like then supporting folks and actually having a like programming and putting resources to and figuring out together, what does it look like to support people like Mitra in St. Paul to then organize within the institution? What does that actually look like, and what is the sort of outside game responsibility in doing that? But more so, and then I would also just say I'm like a little bit uncomfortable with inside outside game language because it creates a false like dichotomy, and it's actually like all one thing. Like we're running one big movement governance piece, and so if we don't have a cohesive, comprehensive analysis around what it looks like to actually make sure that our governing institutions center people and advance democracy and our vehicles to realize the change that we need in our communities, we're never going to get there. And so I just think so much of it is actually shifting the way we've been trained and taught to do campaigns and do organizing, because we're winning and we are leaving power on the table if we don't start shifting to a winning stance where we make as many gains as we possibly can with the folks that we're getting elected at all levels of government.
Yeah, I think this is so critical. And I want to talk about like where you all are putting this into practice, because each of you is here because you're actually like working this out. You're developing these systems, these practices, these different kind of relationships. So what's something you really want to celebrate about what you've been doing around movement politics where you're like, yeah, this is where I'm actually like getting to the thing I want to do?
This is Ruth. I can chime in. I think even within my Democratic Nonpartisan League caucus here in North Dakota, just sharing my perspective and my lived experiences and trying to give a gentle nudge at times to dive deeper, you know, in certain issues that we may be discussing, to add that layer of that intersectionality, I guess it's termed as, but to really think deeper than what's on the surface. You know, one of the things that really inspired me to run for office in 2016, I was just finishing my last semester in the MPH program here at NDSU, Master of Public Health with the American Indian Public Health specialization. And we would always come back to the same thing, that poor health is a result of poor policy. And so when you look deeper, who's making the policies on our behalf? Well, it definitely does not reflect the populations that elected officials are representing. So that was one main area that really forced me to dive deep into the political realm. But again, I think even taking it a step further backward, you know, historically in a historic context, as an Indigenous woman, being a citizen of a federally recognized tribe, and there's so much to talk about there too as well with blood quantum and things. But I grew up on an Indian reservation, and that doesn't mean I'm trying to gaslight anybody that hasn't. That's just my lived experience. And I was born in 1977, and so if you look at the historical timeline, it wasn't until a year later that the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted. So what that meant was that my grandparents, my family, wasn't able to practice who they were freely until a year after I was born. So from birth, I was born into a political system, and even further with the relationship, the government to government, nation to nation relationship that we have with the federal government as tribal nation citizens or even descendants of. So there's a lot of complexities there, and I think the main thing I want to say is that we have to be in these spaces to bring change, as painful as it is sometimes. These systems do need to change. The institutional systematic changes need to happen. I love a more inclusive, collective, bottom-up environment versus one person at the top, almost in a dictatorship role. I don't believe has really worked and really doesn't resonate with me and my cultural values or even values as a human being. I think women's voices need to be out in front more. And that again is kind of tapping into my ancestral memory, I believe, because women have always been held in high regard in the Hidatsa culture. So, Maadzigadads, thank you.
Other celebrations that we want to share. Go ahead, Mitra.
Yeah, I'll share the recent thing that we were able to accomplish in St. Paul, but we actually spent over a year working on a comprehensive new set of tenant protections that engaged a coalition of community partners that spanned like just, I can't even, I feel like I was like in constant regular coalition check-ins, and then there was like this ballooning group of housing organizations and advocates and tenant organizers that were a part of it. And we also were passing this through like a literal pandemic, and so it was really difficult as a process, because a lot of the like tactics that you can use when you're actually like running a policy campaign include like packing the council chambers and like showing up for things, and all of that was just like out the window. Like we haven't been meeting in our public space at City Hall since early March, and our public hearing on the policy itself got pushed like 5 months total overall, just like very far back. And that was really hard, and we had to overcome a lot of just like system system obstacles, things that like were procedural timelines that didn't think about like community needs or where we were at and like what people are going through with housing and coronavirus, and like amendments getting brought in like rounds that would have excluded entire groups of renters from the protections in the policy, and people presenting those amendments as like sensible technical adjustments. And it was like, well, your sensible technical adjustment actually might make it so that people in our community looking for housing with a Section 8 voucher just like won't get a landlord who has to abide by these regulations. And you see kind of some of the concepts in action there from like what I learned at People's Action Institute that we went to, where it talks about neoliberalism, and it talks about like the sort of belief that if you don't regulate something and you just kind of like let the market figure itself out, but you try to facilitate like this weird bizarre in between of like, here's some equity attempts, but then we're not actually literally changing the power dynamic, that actually like harms people. And we saw the mindsets come out, we saw it come out in the way that the policy process happened and all these things. But at the end of the day, I mean, to feel like the opposition at the end of the day was like corporate landlords versus like young women of color coming to testify and talking about making sure the baby doesn't cry and like making sure you look nice for your interview in the hopes of getting a home, and like standing there and feeling judged as you're like literally hoping somebody accepts you to rent in an apartment, and why these protections would change what that dynamic feels like and the power you have in that situation. It was just incredibly powerful, and it was like an example of trying to manage a whole legislative timeline and calendar, share intel across groups of folks, like manage relationships, come up with at every step of the way, like checkpoints for figuring out, do we find these proposals acceptable? Do we find these ones like unacceptable? And just creating a posture toward like everything that came out. And like we just were like this the whole way through. It was like one thing. And we've talked about that concept where it's like all one thing. And we actually ended up passing, like we fought off so many things as a group, and we actually ended up passing something that overall was stronger than the original language, stronger than what Minneapolis passed, like legally went further than what Minneapolis had passed in a parallel ordinance a year ago. And so it just felt like a moment where like all the agony is worth it because you use the power of the government and the law to like change people's lives and level the playing field. And that's like what's possible if you're willing to find a way to work through all of the issues. And I actually was grateful that, I mean, when you are willing to just like come to the conversations with like a movement mindset, and you're like navigating the uncertainty together, you're holding relationships over like the facts of a situation, winning out or not, you're open and expecting folks to be hard on you, like all of that is real and part of it. And you don't actually get there if you're not willing to do those things. We can't be, I like what Juan said, like we can't be fragile in this work, because however we feel in our spots, like there's somebody who doesn't have a home right now in our community, and that is what's actually happening to our people. And if you can't do this job and like hold that at the center and just aspire to hold that even and as things are happening to you in like a violent system in its own way, it's just it's not like what people campaigned for. Like I think of the hundreds of people who just like showed up day after day and were knocking doors with me. And I think in this job every day, like, what did they knock doors for? Was it for you to just like feel bad right now or to like, you know, bust it all down and come up with something better? And it doesn't mean it always feels good, but that is like, I try to hold that space. So I think that victory, it was like a tour of all the things we're talking about. But it's something to be proud of. And we worked really hard on that. So
I love hearing about that process and all the different layers of it, because one, I love hearing that you got actually stronger language than the original. Like, that just feels like such a win to me. And again, like all the different pieces of how to work this as a whole and not as these separate pieces, even though folks are in different roles and different positions. I'm curious though, like one of the things you talked about, Juan and Mitra, is about like not needing to not be fragile, needing to be able to hold critique and, you know, ways that folks come at you. But there's a question from one of our attendees in the chat about whether you face kind of that oppositional frame that Eliane was talking about in terms of purity tests from supporters that may make it hard to actually go through the process of governing. And I wonder if any of you have run into that, you know, that challenge as you're trying to govern using movement politics and movement principles. Juan?
Yeah. In general, I kind of reject the framing of the purity test. I think that as elected officials, it is our job to listen to the folks who are always pushing us to do the most we possibly can and demanding that we live up to the challenges that they and their communities face on a daily basis. I think it's important to keep in mind that serving in this position, regardless of our background, is an extreme privilege. And it is our job to use the privilege and the power that the people gave us to do everything we can to improve their lives. So when I hear politicians, you know, complaining about purity tests, that is a major red flag to me, because that means that you just don't want to do the really hard, uncomfortable things. And I got to tell you, just speaking personally here, we're dealing with a lot of police reform issues. And I am introducing legislation to demilitarize our police force, to ban the use of sedatives within the context of law enforcement activity. That is scary, because I've already riled up the entirety of the Fraternal Order of Police, and they've threatened us with recalls and God knows what else. I don't care. That's what I was put here to do. Some other people might say, well, you have to understand, you know, you have to wait for the stars to align, or this is a really big mountain, you can't move it all at once. I think that's a BS cop-out. It's our job to push for as much as we can, to put all that we can behind these efforts to deliver a more just and equitable society, right? That's why people knocked door for us. That's why people donated to our campaigns. That's why people put a lot of their time into this movement, and it's our job to yield real results.
I want to jump in on this too. I mean, I agree with both what Mitra and Juan were just saying. And I also want to like just invite also their people, like elected officials are people. I mean, it's in my experience, you know, and also like, yes, we have to push as far as we can and we need to move it. And like, we also need to make real gains when our people are in office. And so if we're getting folks elected, we're making demands of and the sort of the movement is making demands of them to go move in a bold agenda. If we're not there to have their backs, not just have their backs, but like to actually build the organization and the infrastructure that will deliver a win, I think it's actually pretty dangerous, because I think what then we're doing is we are lifting up individuals and elected officials as saviors who can go in there and get something done all by themselves because they got elected. And that's just not real. That's just like, that's actually a lie, and that's dangerous. It's a dangerous story to move in our communities. Not only because it's just not real, it's just not actually how change is made and how power operates in the real world, but it reinforces an experience so many of our communities have had of government failing us. And like, I think we got to get real with the fact that like government, like consistently doesn't just like fail us, like actually does harm and like actually kills us, right? And that's intentional. Like there was a strategy by people who wanted to build an institution that locked in their power and moved pain and harm and violence and suppression and oppression across many of our communities. And so then to then lift up false stories around like what is then possible when one of our people get elected does, I think it does like a lot of damage. And so, you know, what we've been seeing in Minneapolis in the aftermath of the uprising is, you know, our city council, we have a powerful majority of values aligned people on the Minneapolis City Council. This took 2 election cycles and winning and losing a mayoral. Like that didn't happen overnight. So they've got a crew, they're not in there alone. And still, the system is designed to not work at every single turn. And so, you know, one thing that I think is really powerful that's happening in Minneapolis that we're figuring out is like, what does it actually look like? Not just to like, you know, like divest from policing, invest in the things that keep us safe and move like a reimagined public safety infrastructure. But we're also developing a new way of governing. You know, I thought what Ruth said was really powerful around, we expect there to be like an executive that gets in and makes decisions and like makes hard calls. And it's like, sometimes we elect an executive and we have a, you know, who's aligned with us. But what's happening in Minneapolis is like, it's actually a collective, it's a council body that is trying to move a thing together. That's actually a very different way of governing that we're not trained as a movement or a general public to understand, to appreciate, to like realize the complicated dynamics of what it means to move a collective forward. And then to build a movement infrastructure around and connected and aligned with that sets it up for success and to continue to move. And so I just like want to like offer that up is like, I think it's really important not to position our elected officials as saviors, both because they can't be, but also they won't last, you know, like they're going to get tired and burned out. And like, there's so much trauma and so much healing that's needed. And so, you know, I just think like we got to like take responsibility for the whole, all of us, and build that infrastructure that allows us to actually begin to win over the long haul and transform these systems that will beat any individual person every single time.
Yeah. And to that end, there's a theme that's come up in a couple of folks' responses that I want to highlight about like relationships and healing, and actually needing to heal the way that we look at these relationships to bring healing to our communities. How do you all think about this frame of healing, this act of needing to bring healing into the way that we govern, and to produce healing through the way that we govern? And Ruth, I'd love to pass it over to you because I know you brought it up in your intro.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I'm not an expert, but I mean, I believe that just from my lived experiences and the teachings that I've received, you know, it's so important to bring healing, not only to ourselves, but our communities and these spaces that we weren't historically welcomed in. But healing, I believe, cannot start until we acknowledge our country's true history that was founded on genocide, you know. And so until we have these uncomfortable conversations, healing is not going to happen. And so we have to have these uncomfortable conversations. We cannot continue to brush things under the rug or leave an entire population's history out of K through 12 curriculum, such as American Indian, Native American history. You don't have to be an elected official to make change. We all know that. For example, in 2017, a group of us, it started from a Facebook post, a question on what do you think about a cultural competency training for our legislators? Because in 2017, our legislators here in North Dakota were pumping out some very harmful legislative bills that not only infringed on human rights, but Indigenous rights. And so we were able to draft a cultural competency bill. We found a champion to carry it forward for us, the only Native American at the time in the state legislature, Senator Richard Marcellus from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. Loved our draft. He said, send us a draft. So we sent it to him and he didn't have any revisions and took it forward through the 5-step process for us. But this bill died by 6 votes in the Senate. And it would have required legislators to take 4 hours of cultural competency training during their orientation And it's not only for Indigenous, American Indian, Alaska Native people, it's for was for all people. It wasn't a win, but it still was a small win because it forced that conversation within the halls of our state capitol. So I think of the necessity to have those uncomfortable conversations because it's going to bring healing. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll join and think about this too. I guess I'll talk first about myself, which is like not where I want to start, but where my brain is going in that, like, the mentality Elian was describing of like, you are burdened with like fixing it all by yourself in the system is like actually bad for the leaders in the elected like sphere too, in that like I have at times in this job felt responsible for things that I don't have control over, for like other people's mindsets that are harmful that are not my mindsets, for actions people took that I did not take, and I have like taken it all on myself. I'm like, if I had done better, that wouldn't have happened, that person wouldn't have been racist, that like it's like I have like internalized like having to confront the totality of it, and then like it, because I didn't single-handedly overcome like a situation that actually requires much more collective power than what I alone can bring. It's like, well, now I'm like a letdown and I'm not good enough, and like people got hurt because of me. And then in reality, it's like you were the only person fighting for like what we believe in that situation, and you like lost because we don't have enough power. And so you're like beat up, and now it's like all your fault, and like it's just hard. And sometimes it's like, yeah, I could have done this better, or like I didn't fight hard enough here, or whatever. Like that's all part of the analysis, is just, well, what else could I have done differently? But I think that like appointing electeds as like an apex of political leadership is problematic in that it just like it sets up a configuration that doesn't actually work and creates a lot of harm also, because then there's like additional harm spread around in that like we didn't get the result we wanted, and then like our community needs that result, and there's all these pieces to it. That's one thing. And then so I guess like in my own healing, I'm working on how do I like not be responsible for other people's like wrong things that they did, at least like within the government, right? Like I can say my control over that was I fought for this thing, I confronted here, I confronted here, and I confronted here, and I like proposed alternative here. So like bring the thing to the table and fight for it that you think would be better. And like that might be the extent of what you can do. And then just like stay in community and keep defining together, what does a win look like for us in this situation? And that's a much more healing way to like proceed than to be like, I failed and we all failed and everything's bad and I'm bad. That's just that way of living like sucks. And then the other thing I've thought about is like, there have been times where like I've been in disagreements with folks or didn't vote the way they wanted to, or something evolved very rapidly, and so like a ton of stuff happened all at once, and then we had to vote, and it was like there was no time to process it, and so people came away from the hearing or the situation or the decision like feeling very upset. And I think like having an understanding of how to approach people and like figure out whether or not you can be part of healing or if there's responsibility you need to take up, that's all part of what you need to think about. And like sometimes people just need space, and you can't like do open heart surgery on the thing right then and there and be like, I want to talk about what just and sometimes people like actually can't process it with you because you're like an elected official, and so the power dynamic has changed, whether or not that's something that you like or feel is real or not. Like that's part of what going from being like not an elected official to an elected official is. And that's weirdness I haven't like figured out, and I think I try really hard to be like a full human vulnerable person in this job. And at the same time, like that is an awareness I've developed, is to say this is bigger than just me. I'm like part of the structure in the system now, and so how do I hold the space well, and like what do I do? So those are some of the things I've learned.
Great. Thank you so much. And I do, I want to end on this note talking about healing, because again, this is something that we really talk about in the Political Healers Project in terms of needing to lift up these stories about what's actually going on in our communities, what is the history of what has been going on in our communities, what's actually happening to us as people. and then being able to create that space where we share stories and we heal from these things together collectively by developing different ways of relating, different ways of doing this, by taking the risk of being vulnerable with each other, and then having the courage to chart forth a path that isn't rooted in what we've been taught we have to do out of our trauma, how we've been taught we have to govern, how we've been taught we have to be in relationship with one another, but that is instead rooted in us coming together and actually building on our visions and our hopes and our dreams and our like deep yearnings for how this can all work together. And so I want to thank you all just for the ways that you are exercising that courage and that vulnerability in stepping out and in creating these frames for what movement politics and movement governing looks like, so that because we are looking to your leadership, not as the apex of leadership, but as examples of folks that we can support, that we can learn from, and where we can also practice this healing together. So I want to give each of you just a quick minute. You know, if you had 30 seconds to just say something that you want folks to know as they leave this panel, what would it be? Juan, I see you ready to go.
Yeah, none of this works without continued community engagement, whether that comes from the organizations that we are members of, and we're doing our grassroots advocacy through, or just our neighbors. We need to make sure that as many people are plugged in as possible. This is not a spectator sport, and I just really want to elevate the point that none of us are saviors. We are basically we are tools for community to use. That's what we really run to do, right? We are servants. And we need you all to lead.
Cool. Eliane, I see you ready to go. What's your 30 seconds?
Ditto. And like keep on organizing. We have to keep on building people power. Democracy doesn't just work. It's our job to make it work. And that takes us choosing it every single day.
Awesome. Mitra.
Thank you. Well, I want to basically just say, and with an eye of answering a question that got asked about like fighting within our party, within a political party, and then also the broader sphere. Like, I think it's an iterative process, and we're in this moment where like the mainstream has shifted left in a way that is just like, I can't remember within my lifetime, and it is because people have fought and lost and been willing to keep fighting, or they have fought and won, and they're like using their gain to multiply our power. And I think that collective iterativeness, it's easy to lose sight of, but I think that is like the global process. It doesn't mean it's not heartbreaking and unfair, and that we don't face unfairness in our spheres and in the structures. But I am sort of sitting with that lately of, we need to do more. And also I am thinking about like what we've gotten to. So those are just some closing thoughts.
Awesome. Ruth, you want to close us out?
Sure. We just need to continue doing the work. I'm so thankful to be in the space with everybody, but again, it's so important that we don't give up. We can't turn this work off and on like a switch. It's constant. We have to think of the people who are like Mitra mentioned, who are almost, whose lives are at stake, who are homeless. That needs to be front and center. And so we need to do more. We can't give up. We have to continue to show up. So, Madzigidads, thank you.
Wonderful. Eliane, Juan, Mitra, Ruth, thank you so much for all the work that you are continuing to do. Thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise here in this panel. Thank you to all of you for coming out and being, part of this conversation, listening in, contributing your questions. We want to invite you all to come and hang out with us for a little bit in the virtual hallway. If you're using your app, or if you're using the desktop interface, there's a session that's running all day through that's called the virtual hallway. We're going to be in there. It's going to be a great place where you can come and you can chat us up directly if you have additional questions and want to talk to some of the members of our panel. And we are excited to continue doing this work of how we not only win things, but also learn to run everything so that we can build out the new world that we really need. Much appreciation to all of you, and have a great rest of your day.